Bible prophecy is active and unfolding daily. Zechariah 12, Isaiah 17, Psalm 83, Ezekiel 38. Here is what the LameStream Media is not telling you. Shalom, my friends. Welcome to this week's newscast. From the Jerusalem Post, Jerusalem's mayor, Nir Barkat, responded on Facebook last Wednesday to calls by Fatah for a day of rage to protest the introduction of metal detectors at the entrances to the Temple Mount, saying, quote, Muslim leaders and the whole world have to understand that the Temple Mount cannot be used as a refuge or as a planning and meeting point for terrorists and murderers. I suggest to the demonstrators to turn their rage at the terrorists who created the need for this. Close quote. P.S. This day of rage, which Fatah declared for Wednesday last week, came and went with relatively few incidents. Demonstrations against security measures at the Temple Mount in Jerusalem seem to be choreographed in a campaign which is led by local Palestinian religious leaders and activists. It's largely an attempt to create a conspiracy against Al-Aqsa where none exists, in order to fan flames and encourage young Muslim men in Jerusalem and the West Bank to defend Al-Aqsa. This is a refrain that's been heard since the 1920s. Palestinians who come from the West Bank already pass through metal detectors at the checkpoints. Muslims on Hajj to Saudi Arabia pass through security and metal detectors on the way. The Temple Mount always has Israeli police at its various gates. Now, Zechariah 12, Isaiah 17, Psalm 83, Ezekiel 38, I could go on and on, my friends, but those are the scriptures that announce my newscast every week. Zechariah 12 is where we see the Father saying, I am going to make Jerusalem a cup that sends all the surrounding peoples reeling. Isaiah 17 is where we see Damascus prophesied as no longer being a city, but a ruinous heap, and it happens literally overnight in less than 12 hours before morning. Psalm 83 is where we see Islam saying of Israel, let the name of Israel be remembered no more. And Ezekiel 38 is where we see Israel absolutely surrounded by a coalition of nations making war with her, while America, Canada, Britain, Australia, and Saudi Arabia do nothing but watch on the sidelines. Those, and quite a few other scriptural prophecies, such as the rebuilding of the Third Temple, which is kind of burgeoning lately in some headlines, are the reasons I deliver this newscast every week, my friends. As a watchman on the wall, I'm looking with great hope and anticipation to see things shaping up in such a way that lets us all know where we are at in terms of the approaching 7-year tribulation, Armageddon, the second coming of Yeshua, and that most wondrous 1,000-year period known as the millennium, when there will be no darkness on earth and pretty much no more death. That is the inspiration behind me starting this newscast, I believe a little more than 3 years ago now. And that's what I look for every week. Things oftentimes seem like there's not too much going on, but if you really take a close look, I kind of covered this in last Saturday's Walking in the Word video, where I talked about the frog in the cold pot of water. Turn on a fire. The water heats up so gradually that the frog doesn't realize he's being cooked. That's the way I see all of Satan's antics over the millennia, centuries, decades, months, weeks, and years, you know? And that's how I look at it here, too. At any rate, turning to wars and rumors of wars, on Tuesday, July 18th, from Sky News, intense clashes broke out between U.S.-backed Syrian fighters and ISIS militants in the heart of Raqqa, the extremist group's self-styled capital. At least 180 civilians in areas controlled by ISIS managed to flee. Reports suggest that the fighting is concentrated in the southwestern neighborhood of Yarmouk, with SDF fighters taking positions near a centuries-old mosque in the city's center. Then on Friday, July 21st, from Arab News, at least 15 Hezbollah militia fighters and one mediator were killed in clashes with militants in Lebanon, close to the border with Syria. Hezbollah carried out a second day of operations against fighters attached to JFS, that's Jabhat Fateh al-Sham, formerly known as the al-Nusra Front, which was aligned with al-Qaeda. The JFS members have taken refuge in Jarud Arsal, a barren mountainous area on the Lebanese-Syrian borders, since the war broke out in Syria's Kalamoun region. Turning to our Intifada update on Tuesday, July 18th, from the Times of Israel, 2 IDF soldiers were injured in a car ramming attack at a checkpoint north of Hebron in the West Bank. The Palestinian attacker was killed. Then on Friday, July 21st, from Algae Minor, 3 adult Israelis, 2 men and a woman, family members taking part in their Shabbat meal, were stabbed to death, and another was seriously wounded Friday night by a 19-year-old knife-wielding Palestinian motivated by the ongoing Temple Mount tensions. He broke into a home in the West Bank community of Halamish. An off-duty soldier who was nearby heard the commotion and ran to the home, where he shot the terrorist and wounded him. The terrorist was thus detained and taken to a hospital for medical treatment. Then on Sunday, July 23rd, from Haaretz, a guard in the Israeli embassy in Amman was stabbed by a Jordanian carpenter who was installing furniture in his apartment. The Israeli security officer shot and killed the attacker. Then on Monday, July 24th, from Haaretz, an Israeli resident of the Arab town of Arara was wounded in a stabbing attack yesterday near Petah Tikva's central bus station by a Palestinian resident of the West Bank town of Kalkilia, who told police that he did it for Al-Aqsa. Looking at our review of last week's news. The introduction of metal detectors at the entrances to the Temple Mount is causing a most unusual series of violent events, most of which seem to be choreographed in a campaign led by local Palestinian religious leaders and activists. The Day of Rage, which Fatah declared for Wednesday last week, came and went with relatively few incidents. Intense clashes broke out between U.S.-backed Syrian fighters and ISIS militants in the heart of Raqqa. At least 15 Hezbollah militia fighters and one mediator were killed in clashes with militants in Lebanon, close to the border with Syria. 2 IDF soldiers were injured in a car ramming attack at a checkpoint north of Hebron in the West Bank. 3 adult Israeli family members taking part in their Shabbat meal were stabbed to death, and another was seriously wounded by a 19-year-old knife-wielding Palestinian. A guard at the Israeli embassy in Amman was stabbed by a Jordanian carpenter who was installing furniture in his apartment. And an Israeli resident was wounded in a stabbing attack by a Palestinian resident of the West Bank. And that, my friends, is what the LameStream Media is not telling you. Abba willing, I'll see you here again next week. Until then, stay safe. Shalom.
Crowded rooms, I need more space than I consume. Enough is time alone with you, underneath a naked moon, sharing confidential moods and making chatter. Mockingbird nocturnal sings notations of eternal things, entering the quantum breeze, flying not for want of wings. He lights his gaze on you and me, simply because we matter.